This is our ornamental front garden in summer 2007. I decided not to do what I normally do, which is to create a garden that needs watering once a week in dry weather. Because of the CSIRO's report, I decided that our front garden would have to depend on natural rainfall. I didn't anticipate 3 years of drought to actually start with the establishment of the garden, but apart from watering the native hibiscus hedge and 2 pot plants, the garden has been established on 6 weeks of watering. Every time I plant something, it'll be watered once a week for 6 weeks just to establish it, and then after that it has to depend on natural rainfall. You can see what the front garden looked like when we moved in, and the reason I put the hedge in is because the house faces east, and the hedge allows us to reduce some of the intensely drying winds that come off Moreton Bay. This is what the garden looked like in September 2004. All the major architectural plants have been put in and surrounded by dish drains, and then I mulched it over. Just over a year on, you can see the hedges well established and the perennials and ground covers are starting to fill out. It's beginning to look like a garden. And at 3 years, there's a certain sense of maturity developing in the garden. This is the Hibiscus insularis hedge. This is my favourite plant. In fact, it's a signature plant of mine because I don't know of anybody else that grows them as hedges. I got 21 plants from the Friends of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney, and that's 3 times more than there are adults left on Phillip Island in the wild. A year after planting and the hedge is looking really good. The interesting thing about this species is that in Sydney it will flower from late spring right the way through to the end of autumn, whereas in Brisbane it flowers in midwinter in one mass during July and early August. The message here about this hibiscus is that not all Australian plants are drought tolerant, and Hibiscus insularis is certainly one of them. It justifies its keep needing 1 drink every week when we have dry weather, but it has required more maintenance than I thought, and possibly if I was restarting the garden I might use them as individual shrubs rather than as a functioning hedge. Either side of the main steps are planted 2 types of palm hyphorbes. This is the spindle palm. There's less than 100 adults left in the wild and they occur on Round Island in the Indian Ocean. It's adapted to cyclonic weather where they have a distinctly wet season and a very long dry season. This is a classic climate change winner. Here are some spindle palms growing at Deception Bay, and you can see what a mature plant looks like. It's very suitable for a small garden. The swollen stem is where they store a little bit of water to get them through the dry season. A very attractive plant, very common in horticulture, and it deserves to be more widely used. The bottle palm is even rarer than the spindle palm, and it comes from the same island. Instead of having a swollen trunk, it has a swollen base, and it serves the same function by absorbing water during the downpours of summer to help get the palm through the dry winters. The bottle palm is also very common in cultivation. This is a grove planted at Darwin Botanic Gardens, so you get an idea of what they look like as they mature. The Chilean wine palm is an endangered palm from Chile, and it's harvested, basically fatally harvested, because they cut the tops off and the flowers off to collect sap during flowering time to make the Chilean wine. It's a very tall landscape palm with a smooth cathedral column-like stem. And I'm very pleased by the way it's performed in our garden. I thought it would do reasonably well, but it seems to be doing exceptionally well, growing twice as fast as they do down in Sydney. This is a bromeliad, and it's one of the bromeliads that doesn't have a tank of water in the centre, and I prefer these plants because they don't encourage mosquitoes into the garden. We've got plenty enough as it is. It also comes from Chile, and so it's adapted to very dry weather, intense UV. They tolerate frost in winter and very hot long dry summers. This is a plant which is performing extremely well, but it's not available commercially. I got my plants from the Friends of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney. Pineapples are something that features in our garden. This is a very ornamental plant, and it's grown for cut foliage and flowers for the industry. Australia only has a couple of native bamboos, and this one hasn't been fully identified. It's just known as Murray Island. It's a very drought tolerant plant, and during winter, during the dry spells, they quite often lose all their leaves, and this plant is creating autumn in the subtropics in my garden right now, and I expect it to be leafless by the end of this winter. It's grown magnificently well on very little water. I've got about 135 different types of plant in the front garden, and not all of them are rare. This kalanchoe is a very common plant in cottage gardens, a real old-fashioned favourite, lovely winter flowers, good as cut flowers, and very easy to propagate. If you grow it on a raised bed, as I'm doing here, then it will cope with a wet summer and a dry winter. It's a real easy climate change ready ground cover. I took about 350 cuttings of this kalanchoe, and all it took was 3 weeks for them to root, and they're now planted out in the garden. This is another old-fashioned cottage garden plant, the Triipomea. It forms a very loose open shrub. It's not a vine, and just like morning glories, the flowers are finished by 11 o'clock in the morning. It does seed prolifically, and so you've got to be careful to dispose of the seed in a plastic bag in a garbage bin unless you're going to propagate it, and it takes very well from cuttings, and so you've got to chop those up and mince them before they go into the compost heap, otherwise they'll start rooting in the compost heap. Otherwise, totally bulletproof, very pretty, and ideal for the back of a border. I love surprises, and this fern grows really well around Sydney Harbour. I didn't think it would do very well in a natural rainfall only garden, particularly when it's growing in shade and it's got lots of tree roots growing around its base. The first time it started to die down during drought, I thought that was it. But it recovered really quickly, and the slide on the left shows it as it is looking at the moment. It's died down and resurrected itself 5 times in 3 years. It's definitely a suitable plant to grow in a climate change ready garden. One of the key things for a climate change ready garden is to have plants that stress well. In other words, when they're suffering from drought, they don't look dreadful. And you can see what this particular Dracaena looks like when it's stressed. It still produces fruit and seed, and the leaves don't look too bad when they start to fall. It keeps its form. It's a wonderful plant to grow because apart from having elegant sword-shaped leaves, it has really sweetly night-scented flowers. This little sage is a favourite of the salvia growers now because it flowers all year round and it is really drought tolerant. The maroon flowers are obviously the attraction, but for me, I like the way it attracts bees into the garden. The only problem with growing this plant is knowing exactly when to prune it because it's always in flower. And for me the decision is, because the flowers and the leaves are sticky, when they start to get in the way of the staircase, that's the time I prune it. Here's a close-up of the flowers. There's a lot of flowers which are sold as being black flowered, and this is one of the closest to a true black flowered sage that I know of. The variegated agave, which is planted along the edge of the path, I knew that this would do well, but what I didn't realise was how well it would do. In the space of a year, it had outgrown its position, and so I had to chop it up and bury it in a trench to turn it into compost. This is the end of the slideshow. Please feel free to have a look at the rest of the website and have a look at our page on other climate change ready plants.